Well, good morning and evening, everyone. We're in a few different time zones, which we'll explain momentarily, but welcome to ACMI. This place where we are meeting is the traditional lands of the Bunwurrung and the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Always was, always will be. And in gathering to talk about stories, about cultural objects, about the world of things we're going to discuss today, we honour their history, their culture, the longest continuing culture in the world, and pay respects to elders past and present and First Peoples who are here with us today. My name is Esther Anatolitis. I am your host for this discussion on the future of museums. It is going to be a pretty fast-paced hour with a fantastic lineup of speakers. We are live streaming the discussion and recording for distribution later via YouTube, which means that we will need to save our questions for conversation over at the book buying table over there, because the discussion with these four really will fly by. This event is being presented as part of the Melbourne Art Book Fair and is of course also part of the ACMI Talks program as we now return for gatherings which are possible again, and how fantastic to see all of you actually here and in person. It's really great. Coming back to ACMI is of course also a welcome to ACMI, given the reinvigoration that the space has seen, which we're going to be hearing more about. So, what has changed in the past year? What's characterised this really vital period of reflection, innovation, reinvention? What old assumptions and models have been tested or jettisoned? What socio-political issues have come to the fore with some really compelling urgency, and how are museum directors rediscovering that sense of purpose and values when it comes to institutions, cultural leadership and the public discussion? András Szántó is here to discuss his new book, The Future of the Museum, 28 Dialogues, which features some deeply insightful interviews on this period of rapid change for museums across the globe. He's a New York-based author and cultural strategist. András is zooming in from New York City, where it is 9 p.m. last night and the middle of a Passover dinner. So welcome, András.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
And we also have three of the interviewees from the book. First of all, Suhanya Raffel is director of M+ in Hong Kong. It is a not yet opened museum. She's zooming in from Hong Kong, where it is just after 9 a.m. this morning. Welcome, Suhanya.
Hello, and very nice to be involved. Thank you for asking.
Rana Davenport is a director of the Art Gallery of South Australia, a museum with quite a long and rich history, also some important reinventions, zooming in from Adelaide, where it is half an hour ago. Welcome, Rana.
Welcome, and terrific to be here. Thanks, Esther.
And Katrina Sedgwick, director and CEO of ACMI, right there.
In real life.
Everyone, please make our speakers feel welcome. Now, let's start with András. In your framing piece, András, there is a great passage that highlights some of the many ways that your 28 interviewees are talking about museums. And I love that kind of highlight. It's a great framing piece. It's an entry point to all of the book, of course. But seeing those highlighted, I saw some really great and generative tensions there. So between museums as reality producers versus being a sanctuary for idealism, or museums as a place where opinions are given voice versus a place where you're free to be right. Museums as living and experimental versus also a safe and welcoming home. So tell us, András, how will the museums of the future both sustain and I guess move forward the complex pluralities that are needed to sustain their purpose and their mission?
Thank you. Well, first of all, before I even attempt an answer to that, I want to say what a difference a year makes. It was exactly a year ago that the idea of this book was even hatched. I remember it was exactly this time of the year that I wrote an article saying, maybe we should reopen museums, which was heresy at that moment. Museums had just been closed down. Nobody could have imagined it would be another year of museum closings. And it was really the response to that piece that then originated the idea of this book, and that feeling that we were really at the beginning of a kind of a new chapter in every aspect of society, but also for museums. And, really, truly, some of my best friends are museum directors, including the ones here today. And the conversations that we were all having, they were all having, we were having, there was a feeling that I had that it's really great to sort of bottle this up and find a way to share it. And of course, it's extraordinary. I think this is the first session since the book that actually has live people sitting in the audience. And we have done dozens of events, including by some of the people here. So I want to thank you all. Thank you, Katrina, and everyone. But I think we have to recognize that we are, in a very different moment. Understandably, when we were doing this book, of course, first and foremost on everyone's minds was the pandemic itself. But I went to great pains to say in the introduction that this book is not about the pandemic. The pandemic will pass. And the truth is that there was already a very deep discussion going on in the field prior to the pandemic. And a whole set of very deep anxieties, if you will, about what the museum will be, but also optimisms about the potential of museums. And, here as elsewhere, the pandemic was just a catalyst. It was an accelerant that pushed those processes forward. And we'll get into that in a second. But I think the number one thing I would say in response to your setup here is how interesting it is that even now, even as you described what is a museum, you had to say 4 or 5 different things, that it is not one thing. And perhaps the most important lesson of this book and of these conversations is that the museum doesn't have to be one thing. Now, this is important because I think there was a perception in our field that the museum is a fairly defined idea, came from a place, up here in the north, and proliferated. But now, particularly since 1989, went all around the world, and here we have M+ opening momentarily. Look at you guys in Melbourne, opening new institutions. And as this has been happening, with this opening up of many locations, museums engaging many situations, many cultures, you begin to see a greater, more open field of possibilities around museums, greater expectations on what they need to do for people, but also a greater tolerance, a kind of new pluralism about what a museum can be. And when I finished these conversations at the end of the summer, I didn't really go into thinking that there would be one message, but when I put them all together, I realized that perhaps the most important message coming out of this is that, yes, there is a new generational mindset on the museum, and above all, it's a mindset of open possibilities, that it's not a one imposed model, but it's, as one of the directors put it, it's museums instead of museum. So I look forward to exploring this with my great colleagues here today.
Yes, that good point about it being the future of museums, and that sense of that any museum is doing more than one thing, and of course any place that we are on is more than one place. In András's interview with Suhanya, she speaks of location as palimpsest, as something which is already telling multiple stories. And Suhanya, tell us, for those of us here who don't know West Calhoun, who don't know the context in which M+ will soon come to be, tell us about, I guess, your specific geographic but also cultural context.
Yes, let me just pick up on a point that András said about museums being many things. And for us at M+, we are already a functioning museum waiting for our building to be ready to open. So we have been collecting, we've been exhibiting, we've been doing symposia, we've been doing all kinds of work, in fact, reached over 1 million people with that material. And it's very interesting to think about this year when we went digital, all museums amplified their digital footprint, even though we had already initiated that as part of museum making. We had just our learning programs in the last 5 months reached 300,000 people. When we went online, which if we hadn't, when we were doing it physically, maybe only reached 10,000 people. So it gives you a sense of scale in terms of how the digital reaches people in a way that the physical is contained. There are pros and cons for both. So this sense of how a museum exists, it exists in many ways. And we have already been in the imagination of the people of the city of Hong Kong, but beyond as well. But to go back to the physical M+, we are on a site on West Kowloon, which faces Hong Kong Island. It's a premium site on Victoria Harbour, 40 hectares, set aside to build major cultural infrastructure for Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a leading city for finance, for IT, for all kinds of other industry, and the people here felt absolutely certain that it needed to build cultural infrastructure, that cultural capital was an essential part of the city's identity, and invested seriously in that project. And so M+ is one of several cultural institutions, one of 2 museums, and we have a very beautiful building designed by Herzog & de Meuron, the Swiss firm, and that construction has just completed. It's a very large institution of scale, similar to Pompidou in Paris or Museum of Modern Art with their expansion in New York, or the Tate Modern with the Switch House expansion. So extremely large physically, but it also encapsulates the ambition to be an institution of equivalence from Asia. And there is no other institution in Asia that brings in the collection interests of design, architecture, moving image, visual art of the mid-20th century and into the 21st century. So this is a very unique institution for Asia. It's really establishing a sense of the importance our stories being told from here, so that we're not a footnote in the canonical aesthetic and cultural histories of Euro-America. It's important to reframe that and to reframe it using our voices and our stories. We were thinking about what does it mean to think about the shifts in moral standards across our various institutions over even in the last year. It's about communities engaging and seriously participating in shaping what institutions are, continue to be, and evolve to be. And that's a process that we have been undertaking intensely. And sometimes the sharp end of that is indeed very sharp, and it helps think and make us articulate more clearly how to navigate and move through that.
Yes, indeed. And I think drawing from the interview, what you say about the scholarly, artistic and independent voice of the museum, I think is really exciting and draws out what you've just said about the balance between the institutional, the physical, the collection. Tell us, I guess, just delving into that independent voice, what happens when that voice is politically challenged?
Yeah. So it's for the first time in Hong Kong, we are seeing an institution, a global institution with the kind of governance structures that are global best practice. And that includes acquisition policies, museum boards, finance subcommittees, that kind of structure with acquisition policy and collection management policy online, the collections beta itself being made transparent. All of that work has been done in the last 5 years, intense work, given that the collection is now 8,000 objects and 46,000 archives. So substantial founding collections being put into place. But with that also comes the responsibility of being a public institution that works within the laws of Hong Kong's SAR government. We are, like any public institution, are never going to break the law, but at the same time, our academic and scholarly credentials, our professionalism underscores everything that we do. So we know that a museum, has a role. When we work with our collections and exhibitions, we are very certain that we present a professional, objective, unbiased voice, while at the same time stimulating discussion, debate, learning, knowledge, research, pleasure. And those things are being tested right now. And we continue to reiterate and say it again that that's our purpose. And right now we're feeling that this is a debate that's taking place in Hong Kong in a very particular manner, but also feel certain that we will work through it. Because once the large museums with our collections are on display, I think that's when the people in Hong Kong and beyond will actually understand and see that big museum work that we in the industry understand, but maybe not understood in a general public. And it's very clear in Hong Kong that we have to develop that museum-going public, a public that is that understands the learning that is essential to the work we do.
I mean, I think this is one of the most interesting and also contentious roles of the museum as an institution that, as we were saying with András as well, there isn't one role of a museum, there isn't one group of audience members, there isn't one cultural group. Let's talk a bit, Rana, about the role of the museum around, just picking up on András's point as well about whether museums should have opened or closed during COVID. There is a great point in Rana's interview where she says that artists expand our experience of the world. And obviously that is going to be, an animated and a contentious thing. But as director of the Art Gallery of South Australia, she and her colleagues are museum workers, were seen as being essential workers during the pandemic, but artists were seen as non-essential, which created quite a tension in terms of the support that an institution offers. What was that like, Rana, in the ways and I guess the approach that you took in balancing that institutional voice and the support of artists during that time?
Thanks, Esther. Yes, well, firstly, Ghana Yatanga Yuandi. I honour the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Yes, we were the last to close and the first to open of the public art museums in Australia. And I think one of the main reasons is our Premier is the Arts Minister. He's the Minister for Reconciliation and Aboriginal Affairs. He's the Minister for Tourism. And all of those things coalesced, I think, in his strong understanding and support for the arts. And they were actually, South Australia was one of the first to launch a series of ended up being about 2.5 million for artists during the COVID period. But it was ironic, I thought, that we were essential as government employees, but artists were non-essential. And yet museums, the very basis of museums is artist practice. So they are our world and our reason for being, and yet they were categorised in a different way. One of the first things we did, I think within a week or two actually, is repurpose some of our funding from foundations that was going to go to public events and repurposed that to artist bursaries. So we provided for $6,000, $10,000 bursaries for artists to do whatever they could do, and all that was required was an explanation of how things were being affected in their lives in terms of their practice. And we worked very fast, and it was really interesting, all those discussions. I was really impressed with what the Art Gallery of Western Australia did, and it freed up a couple of $1 million actually. Ours was much less than that, and provided a bursary of sorts of $2,000 for every artist in South Australia who was in the collection to work on their archive during this period. So it was really fascinating to see how artists, how museums could respond directly for artists who are that, as I said, our reason for being. It's interesting, and I really enjoyed in your introduction to 28 Dialogues, András, that great summary of commentaries about what museums were, starting with Gottfried Semper, museums being the true teachers of a free people. He was the architect, of course, for the V&A, and then Alfred Barr in 1944 talking about, and I think this is very important, helping people enjoy, understand, and use the visual arts of our time. And that's something that I'm sure any museum director always, when we're looking at acquisitions, how useful is this work going to be for us, and the kind of narratives and the kind of conversations that we might pose within a museum. And then, you move on to Alexander Dorner in 1947 about the new type of museum. It's more of a power station or producer of new energy, which has a great sense to it. But, in my research, it seems that the first museum director was actually a Mesopotamian princess, Enigaldi Nana, 2,500 years ago in the city of in today's southern Iraq. And what I love about the priestess and princess is that she took her father's collection, and he had been, plundering around the world as princes and kings did. But also she was very focused on education for women. So not only was she actually wrote, didactic panels explaining the meaning of all of these works, and she accumulated them together, but also she set up a school for women, which, 2,500 years ago, we've still got a long way to go. So it's interesting to think about that educative and that research role of museums as well. Yes, thinking too, it's been, we're not going to talk too much about COVID obviously today, but also thinking about our whole program. It really gave us, because museums are, spaces of wonder, encounter, and empathy, and I've always believed that objects, are portals to other times, other spaces, other perceptions, other ways of thinking about the world and being in the world. And having been really focused, and when I worked for many years with Suhanya, had the great pleasure of working with Suhanya on the Asia Pacific Triennial, and my whole world was looking absolutely and only at contemporary art practice. And now working in an institution that's very proud of its extremely quite encyclopedic collection and 47,000 works from a range of different spaces and geographies, and how the conversations that can be set up, and my great belief that all great art was contemporary once. So that kind of contemporizing and usefulness of culture within a contemporary time. So yes, I think when we took stock, like everybody did, as András calls it, the great pause, and how we rethought what exhibitions could be, and it completely rescoped our exhibition program for this year. And at the moment, we have an extraordinary exhibition of the work of Clara Speckett that your Melbourne audiences will know very well, and 130 works. We'd acquired 21 works of hers last year through a patron, but it's an exhibition about slow looking, and in some ways here is an artist that actually worked in isolation for the whole duration of her life, 16 years as an artist, and all of which living in one location in Beaumaris where she was looking after her parents. And the experience of the exhibition itself slows one down. It takes the arc of one day from dawn through high noon to dusk and to nocturnes and twilight. And it's been really fascinating just watching how an expanded presentation of one single artist's work can really connect with people, and the emotional power that exhibition can provide. So as with many museums, I think what this opportunity has given us, this traumatic, convulsive time that we've all been through, has definitely affected, I think, both curatorial and practice, but also the great questioning of who we are and how we can be more useful in the world today.
Absolutely. I think we've all had that experience of that very welcome opportunity to slow down and take time is super, super important. Rana, tell us the name of that the Mesopotamian princess again?
Princess.
Yes.
Yes. Priestess Inelgali Nana.
Well, she is our new hero, Inelgali Nana. I think I'll be reading up. But of course, that is a reminder that, this notion of dashing around the world, plundering, unfortunately, did remain a bit of a hobby for museums for quite some time. We've had some really important conversations, very recent ones, about repatriation. We're seeing governments and institutions around the world really taking that seriously now. It's certainly been something that Suhanya has worked on at the Art Gallery of New South Wales when she was here, at other institutions, and Rana, it's something that you're looking at right now. Tell us how this period has also been a catalyst for really thinking quite responsibly about the ethics of what is in a museum's collection and how those objects should be treated and returned when appropriate.
Yes, well, this started, of course, across all of museums in this country some time ago. And in 2014, there was a strong push and collective energising towards thorough collection provenance. And what we undertook at the Art Gallery of South Australia ended up in September 2019 of the repatriation of a wonderful Shiva Nataraj to the Nelai, town of Nelai in Tamil Nadu, 600-year-old piece. It was acquired in 2001. It was a time when there wasn't the same examination of collection provenance, and indeed it was reported missing in 1982. And what was really interesting is that our Asian curators were very diligent, I suppose, from 2014 and looking at everything in the collection. We have a very large collection of historical work from Asia, and mainly Japanese and Southeast Asian, but some South Asian as well. And it was actually at the Institute of Pondicherry where James Bennett actually went through and thousands of images until he found an image from 1958 of our Shiva Nataraj in the temple, in Temple Nadu. And on the basis of that, we alerted the Indian authorities and then funded the repatriation of that work, which was unusually returned to the actual temple, because there can be quite complexity about where artworks are repatriated to. And it was pretty great to see the level of celebration and the street festival where thousands and thousands of people garlanded in flowers, and the actual Shiva Nataraj itself to be garlanded and returned to its temple. So there are other works, of course, and ongoing research At the moment, we don't believe anything is problematic, but I think it's just a case of constant vigilance. As new information comes to light, it's not something that one takes a sweep of a collection and then puts a full stop behind it. I think it's just part of our responsibility when we have historical collections to and it's not just Asian artifacts, of course, and this is tremendously important in relation to First Nations works as well. But it's just a state of constant vigilance, I think, and we are often asked, and we're very happy to respond to questions in this regard, and all public art museums in this country changed at that time and for the better.
Yeah, I think this is one of the critical questions for the future of museums, and many of Andras's interviews in the book touch on this question of repatriation. But staying with the question of First Peoples, and let's bring Katrina in. Katrina, ACMI looks great, and you know, it's just it's super thrilling. We've got a couple of former board members here, and others who I'm sure have had the chance to go through and enjoy. But tell us, Katrina, about the framing of the permanent collection, the importance of First Peoples and First Peoples stories first. Tell us about what led to that. How was you know, that first moment, and then the framing at the other end. How did that come about?
Yeah. And I'd like to acknowledge as well that we meet here today on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Yeah, it was really important for us. I mean, we have this rare opportunity with the government investing substantially in the reimagining of a museum that at that point was about 15 years old. And the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, it's a big story to tell across film, television, video games, digital culture and art. It's a global story. It's a story that spans, I mean, film was invented at the end of the 19th century, but it's a longer story than that. And we thought really hard about how we needed to tell it from ACMI's perspective. We've created an exhibition called The Story of the Moving Image, but of course you can tell it in so many different ways. So what is our story of the moving image? And if it's an Australian story, it's about place, it's about where we are right now. So we approached Screen Australia. They have a remarkable department, the Indigenous department, which was about to celebrate 25 years. And they had run an extraordinary program that has enabled an absolute flourishing of storytelling by First Peoples in Australia across film and television. And they were brought together about 25 practitioners from right across the country to workshop the plans for their celebration, and we were fortunate enough to have 2 hours of their time. And so we talked to those practitioners about what they would like to see in this kind of museum, telling this kind of story. And they talked a lot about how First Peoples in Australia have been using shadow and light to tell their stories for tens of thousands of years. And shadow and light is indeed the building block of the moving image. And so they really wanted us to kind of represent that continuing story and reflect that storytelling doesn't sort of start and end at a particular point. It is an ongoing continuum and a conversation between past and present. So we came back from that and we established an Indigenous advisory group and appointed 2 First Nations curators who subsequently changed over during the course of the project. So 4 different First Nation curators have worked on this exhibition over a 3-year period. And through that process, we approached Vicky Cousins, who's a Gunda Chamara woman from Victoria. She is a practitioner in the area of public art, though she doesn't often call herself an artist as such. She's also been heavily involved in the reclamation of her language and also in working in the kind of re-energising and remaking of possum skin cloaks, which has been hugely important over the last kind of 15, 20 years. So she's created a work for us which really pulls apart these themes in a beautiful way, and it frames the exhibition at the start. It's a two-part work at the start and at the finish of the exhibition. So as you come in, it's a work called Yanmia, which means flickering in the firelight in her language. It has a contemporary representation of ceremony, of corroboree, painted up on the ceiling. It's painted by her sister, her nieces and her daughter. And these figures, they're musicians and dancers in ceremony. And they're painted up with ochre. And the flickering in the firelight sort of captures the fact that there was this storytelling being told by a community around the fire at night with dancing and movement, and the reflections and the shadows in that light is how those stories were communicated. And so then underneath that, she's got a half a tonne of acrylic that represents a lens. And as you look through that lens into that ceremony, she's kind of carved into it. So it gives a representation of movement. And so this lens captures a particular way of observing these figures. So it's just a really stunning kind of representation. She's also created a kind of graphic image which appears on any label in our exhibition where it is work by a First Nations person. If the work is about a First Nations person, it doesn't have that emblem, but it has an interpretation by a First Nations person of that work. And then when we leave the exhibition, we walk out through a room and a kind of corridor that is filled with those figures, now cut out of a kind of stainless steel where you see yourself reflected. And again, it's just really talking about place, perspective, and again, this continuum of storytelling that we're all part of. It's been an incredibly rich and exciting process for us, and the Indigenous Advisory Group is going to continue working with us now, ongoing. Those two curators are going to be working with us ongoing. At the beginning of this, I'm ashamed to say that this institution didn't have a single First Nations employee. We now have 4, and we will be continuing to very actively expand on that employment, because I think when you're talking about reconciliation and representation, it's through not only the content that you present, it's who's selecting that content, and it's also your staff, and then of course a very active engagement with First Nations audiences, which we're working on as well. So it's a really exciting time for us, recognising that we're at the very beginning of a journey of engagement with First Nations peoples, but we're very proud where we are, and the work that our curators and advisory group have done, I think, is extraordinary.
It absolutely is, and I've been thrilled to see how people have responded and engaged with that, but in particular I think it's a great welcome into the collection, which I hope everyone's had the chance to enjoy. But I think also a really important segue now to talking about the future of museums, because it's what you just described, Katrina. I think of the words of First Nations curator Clotilde Bullen, who talks about the distinction between the decolonialisation of museums as compared to the indigenisation. So there's a difference between thinking that, you know, as a white fella, I'm somehow going to, you know, decolonialise an institution, as opposed to, you know, how do we indigenise, how do we bring in and then welcome and then have the leadership of First Nations professionals. And Katrina talked about museums as a place of audacity and courage. I forget now whether this was in the interview or in our kind of email chats, but the chapter which is the interview, Andras's interview with Katrina, is called Immersive Experiences. And as just bringing together what we've all just been talking about, this multiplicity of experience, that there are multiple ways of engaging with a museum, that it's museums, that it's, you know, multiple collections, that each of us who comes in brings our own experience. Katrina, how can the museums of the future, who haven't got the opportunity to physically reinvent themselves from the inside, how can the museums of the future be making sure that they are both offering those multiple experiences, but also drawing on multiple perspectives and cultures to present those experiences?
I mean, I think it's part of it is around really interrogating purpose, and that's been a very interesting journey for ACMI. And I think thinking very seriously about, when we talk about access, what does that actually mean? First of all, it's about access in terms of the physical access to the place. It's about access to the stories that we tell. It's about access where it's not just a passive experience of engaging and viewing a work, but where you as a visitor have agency. In our case, working with the audiovisual materials that we do, there are opportunities for access in terms of reuse, about being able to creatively engage with content and play with it and reshape it into new works. It's also about a museum actually spending money and putting staff resource behind that purpose in terms of invitation. If you want to have a culturally diverse audience, it doesn't just happen. You've got to get rid of a whole lot of barriers to access, which are about the stereotype of what a traditional museum is. We are, in a physical sense, edifices, buildings. It's hard to cross a threshold. How do we invite a community into our buildings that reflect the community that we're sited in? And that is a massive challenge, and that takes staff resource, it takes genuine commitment, it takes a different way, as I said, of recruiting your staff so that the people who are greeting and making content for the visitor, again, reflects genuinely the community that we're in. And these are big challenges that need to be addressed. I think the other thing that is a really exciting opportunity, and again, it does come down to money, but we've had a wonderful opportunity at ACMI, is thinking about access in the sense of how we can use digital tools to open up what a museum experience is. And I think we were just talking before about this transformation that we've had during the pandemic. I think everybody was kind of going there, but all of a sudden we had to, as an audience member, go through our screens to engage with culture, which I think really changed what a visitor was looking for and what a visitor was prepared to engage with. But also we were trapped. We just had to communicate through screens. And I think that offers huge opportunities. And one of my experienced team is here actually, Lucy, who's been a really key part, Lucy Patterson, a really key part of the journey that we've been on in thinking about, okay, you've got these other platforms. How do they help us in this time where geography, the ability to travel physically is so limited? How do we pull those levers and use them in a new kind of way? So, we were shut, but we expected to open in April. So we've had a sort of extension of closure, and we used that time, for example, to think about the permanent exhibition that we were making, Story of the Moving Image. Well, how can we use the internet? How can we use digital to tell some of those stories that we can't tell in the physical space in an online space? And we designed the Story of the Moving experience. So it's utterly different to the physical exhibition. We're not trying to replicate that. We're trying to use a digital space to tell stories. So we've got sort of 6 strands that are riffing out of the curatorial journey that's been explored inside the physical space. And Seb Chan, who's our Chief Experience Officer, has been describing it not so much as a museum, but like an online magazine. So it's museum as magazine, and it's using that online space to do what's good in that space, and then it's using the physical space to do what's good about being in a physical space. And I think that's quite interesting.
There truly is so much to explore in the new ACMI, but also across the range of museums that András has had the great pleasure to have some insightful interviews on. Just on that point about shifting models, needing the money to make big change. Suhanya mentioned earlier being an institution that's not yet a physical space but has been operating, has been participating in discussions. There are museums around the world having those or being faced to have some complex discussions around rethinking business models, considering the deaccessioning of items, of having to look at their collections as assets in other ways. Suhanya, how have you been balancing, I guess, these multiple ways of moving towards the opening of a museum while actually being a functioning institution and having to rethink the whole kind of economics of it all? It's just, what a minefield.
Yeah, I wanted to add also that the issue of diversity is an essential part of our, and it's interesting when you look at in Plus, we have over 23 nationalities in our staff, and our location is part of that reality. It's a very cosmopolitan city, Hong Kong, and so when we do our their lectures or symposiums, we're often doing simultaneous translations in many languages, Japanese, Mandarin, Cantonese, English at the same time. It's not unusual. And the capacity to do that is already inside and embodied in the professional staff of the institution. So we're very alert to that. And one of our advantages has been, by being able to build a new institution, we have been alert to being to building that capacity inside who we are. That's an advantage by being a new museum. We don't have to undo and repack because we're learning while we're doing that. So that voice of diversity is essential, especially in Asia, where histories, languages, ethnicities, religions, it's a fact. So we need to reflect on that. And art gives, form to really complex realities and emotions, and we need to be able to encompass that. Business model, very big part of all of our conversations. How do we financially sustain, environmentally sustain, emotionally sustain, especially in this year, the notion of well-being is critical, and the museum plays a critical role in that. And we've done work around well-being with communities and young ones. Interestingly for me, in Hong Kong, it's very, very clear that our core audience is under the age of 40. We already know 40% of our audience is a young, youthful audience. Very serious, very engaged, wanting to participate in that broad work. So this is, this is a reality in Hong Kong, and we're looking at that business model being a diverse set of, ticketing, patrons, corporate support, the usual, museum financial situation, but we will explore it. I mean, for us, we sit in a very interesting city, a small city of 7.5 million, but when the borders open, it's, we have 80 million people coming into the city. No other city in the world has that kind of volume of people moving in and out.
And that's just extraordinary.
Can I jump in on that
András,
point?
Please.
Well, yes, I think that, there's a reason, by the way, why the very first chapter in the book is M+. This was not ever going to be a book that started with a European or American museum, because it wanted to be about the future. And indeed, the great luck of institutions like M+ is that they can go straight to 2.0, that they don't, as Suhanya was saying, they don't have to unlearn. It's very difficult to unlearn because the past assumptions have been so deeply baked into the museum, including its form. So many museums sitting up on a hill, you have to approach it on a set of steps. They look like temples. The layout of the museum reflecting an already outdated idea about cultural hierarchies. None of that weighs on that particular museum. Obviously with ACMI, you can build a museum to today's technologies. And the point I really want to make, though, is that with all due respect to the 4,000-year-old colleague who isn't in the book because I couldn't interview her. But the reality is that museums are really, as we know them, are relatively young institutions. And the real takeaway that I had, and this conversation today really takes me back to my summer, your winter, where we were sitting for hours and hours. But what's really striking is how different this conversation is to what this same conversation would have been 30 years ago. I mean, number one, to state the obvious, you have 3 directors on this call who are women. And indeed, half of the directors in the book are women, which also was very important to me. But the issues that people are worried about, are thinking about, and the way they talk about them is so different. I first discovered this working with a project we were doing at the Metropolitan Museum, through which I met Rana and Suhanya, a colloquium for museum directors. And what struck me is that the things they wanted to talk about were not the things that you usually see museum directors or you imagine them talking about. They wanted to talk about community and reconciliation and new ways of storytelling and acknowledging the indigenous voice and shifting perspectives and making the museum polyphonic. And there really is a kind of a generational sea change happening. But going to the business model question, which is what you asked about, there is a nagging issue underneath all of this, which is this. What we're seeing is a very rapid expansion of the remit of the museum, of what society expects museums to do. You are supposed to, of course, do what you've always done, collect and exhibit and interpret and study and conserve objects. But now people are looking to the museum as an agora, as a public place, as a place of encounter, as one of the few places in society where you can meet all kinds of people. And by the way, a place where you can catch a movie and listen to jazz and get a great sushi and have a wonderful green roof where you can engage with the fauna of your local ecosystem. All of this is enormously expensive. It's very expensive to do all these things. So on the one hand, museums are being asked to do more and ever more. On the other hand, their business models, whether they're getting it from the state or from private individuals, are relatively constrained. And this puts a lot of museum directors, and I can see they're all nodding, in a little bit of a fix. Because you want to have that broad remit, you want to be all things to all people at all hours of the day, all days of the year, but how do you pay the bills? Especially if some of the more adventurous ways of doing that, for example, the accessioning was mentioned, are highly contentious, and there's a great deal of public scrutiny being placed on these institutions, and whenever they do something that's different and innovative, they are very quickly going to be in the crosshairs of public scrutiny for good reasons. People really care about them, but it's very difficult to do this tightrope act.
Yes, it certainly is. And we've just, in the last nearly an hour, because goodness me, we are almost out of time, we have raised so many absolutely critical issues that I'm sure we're all reflecting that aren't just about the future of museums, but they really are the questions of how do we engage with one another? What are the platforms that offer us the chance to do that, to be deeply critical, to have that sense of invigoration, but also that sense of connection with artistic practice, with a range of cultures. I'm going to ask each of the 4 of us, just in the spirit of the future of museums, and as the interviewer, curator of the book, I'm going to give András the final word. And I'm going to start with Rana to ask about now thinking of not just yourselves as museum directors, but as people who enjoy to visit museums. What is just in a sentence or two? What is your advice to museum directors in thinking about the future of museums that they are creating, perhaps from your experience, perhaps from what you've seen and loved or read in the book? But Rana, what's your advice as someone who visits museums, about where the future of museums should go?
Wonderfully big question, Esther. Thank you for that. Well, I think what collections do in relation to museums is, recalibrate the past, negotiate the present, and then imagine the future, allowing a platform. And I refer to Ulafa Eliasson's comment about museums as reality co-producers rather than being containers per se. And it's very interesting. Like many people in my world, I had planned to travel an extraordinary amount last year. It didn't happen. And yet I think I've never thought about the museum more intensely, perhaps other than the 3 weeks with you, András, in downtown New York with the Met program. But living and breathing, thinking about museums every single day, taking the role that I have, deeply seriously, talking about these things with my team, thinking really hard about what to unlearn, what to undo, what to do, what to learn, what to be alert about. And one thing we haven't talked about today, which would be another whole hour, and on Thursday night I chaired and moderated a fascinating discussion with the CMAM group about sustainability and what this whole last year has done in terms of reshaping the models that exist and recalibrating all aspects of what we do within museums and how we move forward. And if we don't learn, that's the problem. So I think this constant state of examining oneself and essentially providing the platform for artists. I mean, it's all about artists, and artists do give us the solutions. Ask an artist, they will come up with solutions. And Jeremy Deller was part of that conversation on Thursday night, and it was, wonderful with his interjections and commentaries throughout. So I think the future is fine because artists are our pulse of our humanity.
Oh, Rana, brilliant. Thank you. Katrina, what is your advice to directors of museums in orienting us to that future of museums?
I mean, I don't want to suck up to him, but I think you should read this book because because I've found it incredibly inspiring.
Yeah,
and
as did I.
Particularly the stories actually that have come out of Africa. Those museums that are operating in an utterly different kind of paradigm and often with hardly any money, very different kind of infrastructure, and the completely kind of radical reimagining of how a museum functions within a specific place and a specific community. And again, it's all about opening up a conversation, an ongoing conversation with that community about the work of artists. And I think that kind of really radical, fresh imagining and allowing ourselves to not be kind of worn down as kind of, I mean, you can very easily become a bureaucracy. And I think the future of museums is enjoying that in our situation, really enjoying that resource, but enabling that to be a sort of starting point to springboard into experimentation. And within that's about ongoing consultation and conversation. So again, agency. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things that's changed, isn't it? The agency has shifted outwards. And reflecting on that, I mean, that's incredibly exciting. In our case, the people of Victoria own what's in here. And so how do we make sure that they have agency in the conversation? So I think that's the future.
Suhanya, agency, artists, that sense of reflection and learning and unlearning. What about you? What's your advice?
Yeah, I think it's really, our museums in this time and place now, it's very, very clear that the community are completely engaged with our work. Unlike, even as András said 10 years ago or 30 years ago, it's a very different reality. That's good. We've made a huge effort to become part of a civic project. But with that also comes the sense of needing to understand that this is not static, it's a moving and evolving conversation with your audiences. Sometimes they're not going to agree with you, and that's going to be challenging, but that is part of the work we do. And we need to embrace and face that and work with it. I think it's about fluidity and alertness.
Oh, I like that. And András, in a sense, to think about the future of something so complex, really one of the best offerings you can make is the insights of 28 people. You've been having a number of conversations about the book. What are the new crystallizations in your mind about what these futures look like?
Well, I'll come back to the question you asked, and as I said, the only possible answer to what you just said is read the book. But the original question was, what advice to give to a future person? And as one moderator to another, I want to first of all thank you for this great, extraordinary job you've done today. But I have to tell you, also as one moderator to another, I asked the same question from many of the directors in the book, and in fact, in almost every conversation, some of them edited it out because you have to realize these conversations sometimes were many hours long. But I think the most original answer I got in the book from a director to this question came from the well-known curator and director of the Serpentine Gallery, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who said, if a young museum professional or curator came to me to ask, what should I tell them about museums? I would turn it around and ask them what they think. And I actually think that really goes to the heart of this new posture of museums, that it's not necessarily always our job to dispense the wisdom downwards, but today's museum is a more lateral relationship and needs to be able to listen, and especially from younger generations. So I think, we're more or less the same age on this panel, but I think now our challenge is to learn how to listen to the younger generation. And I think along with that, to actually answer your question, I think I would go with something like what Rana is saying, which is this need for the museum to be able to be a not fixed thing, but a thing that can change, a kind of machine for changing. Because as you've seen, there's already a lot of change going on, but change is accelerating. Even in the last few weeks, we have been hearing about non-fungible tokens and, new ravages of climate change and, just new things coming, almost every day, and certainly more around the corner. So I think that the number one job is to make sure that whatever institution you build, it builds in that flexibility and adaptability to change. And that also is good advice for the museum directors themselves, which is that no matter how much of a revolutionary change agent you are, at a certain point, it's going to be time to get out of the way, because it's going to be the next generation's job to keep pushing the museum further into it.
Oh, I like that a lot. The book is The Future of Museums, 28 dialogues. It's, as well as just being full of just some really great insights, it's superbly well designed in the sense of the questions, some of which repeat, some of which emerge. So you're getting this wonderful sense of, dialogue between everyone who András has interviewed. The interview with Suhanya is titled Location. The interview with Rana is titled Indigenous Voices, and the interview with Katrina, Immersive Experiences. You can buy the book right over there just after this, which is extremely convenient. And those who are joining us online through the ACMI shop and no doubt other places as well. Thank you to the ACMI tech team who have made us look and sound absolutely perfect. Big, big thank you. Thank you so much to Rana Davenport, Suhanya Raffel, Katrina Sedgwick, and the author or curator, I should say, of the book, András Szántó. Fantastic to have had this conversation. And thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic day and enjoy the rest of the Art Book Fair.